Hello, welcome to this episode of Dispenser of Knowledge. In this particular episode, we're going to be talking about weird history. Now, by weird history, I mean outside XRay, strange, slightly trivial history. I don't mean who, won the Battle of Waterloo, although there's a certain amount of evidence that Napoleon lost it because he had hemorrhoids and couldn't mount his horse that day. But that's a story for another video. And we're going to talk a little bit about animal history today. Now, some of it's a little darker, but I have to say that karma wins in the end. All of these stories have the person who deserves justice receiving justice. Also, I have notes in front of me today because I want to get the dates and times right. I missed a few on my last video. There were some complaints. And it's a memory issue for me, being autistic and having an acquired brain injury, I sometimes forget nouns and dates. So if you see me look down, I'm looking at my book. It's not that I'm not interested in you, because we all know that you guys are the coolest people in the universe, right? Also, just to make this a little more fun, I'm going to put on my silly animal hat. See if I can get my ears straight here. Okie dokie. Silly animal hat is now in place. And today, we are going to talk about the use of animals in the military. Now, there's been some uses of animals in the military that are perfectly acceptable and absolutely cool. As a matter of fact, there are Ranger, Green Beret, and SEAL dogs who do things like jump out of airplanes with their handlers. These dogs have played pivotal roles in various battles. They have actually saved lives. They have discovered IEDs. They've been used to find battlefield casualties. They've been used as rescue dogs and so forth. But there's also been some much stranger experiments. And I'm going to talk about those today. I actually want to talk about some of the weirdest conceptual army weaponizations that you can imagine. And we're going to start with bat bombs. That's right. I said bat bombs. So, here's the deal. It was called Project X-Ray, according to my little book here. And they used Mexican free-tailed bats. And there was a guy, he was a dentist. He was also a friend of Eleanor Roosevelt, which is how this all got started. He talked to Eleanor and reminded her of all the good times they had, and Eleanor in turn talked to President Roosevelt. Now, this guy's name was Lionel S. Adams. Like I said, he was a dentist. He was from Pennsylvania, and he felt that that qualified him as a weapons expert. Well, maybe. I've been in a whole lot of pain in various dental chairs. Anyway, in March of 1943, our friend Lytle decided that he was going to tie napalm to bats. They would release the bats would fly over to enemy territory, they'd roost at night. The napalm bombs were timed incendiaries, they had fuses on them. The fuses would burn down, or in the less crude versions, a timed fuse would burn down. And when it did, the bats would turn into flaming bombs in other people's, attics, garrets, airline hangars, places where bats slept. The theory was that this would burn down the various enemy hangars, and the Germans were the primary target. So it was decided that this needed to be tested, obviously. And there were some refinements along the way. Instead of just tying the bombs directly to the bats, which oddly enough could lift more than their own weight, so that at least was feasible. An engineer by the name of, Louis Pfizer, who was a Devil Dog Marine who specialized in IEDs, decided to build a sort of bomb container. And it basically looked like your average bomb, except it had 1,000 compartments. Each compartment had a little spring-hinged flap. The spring-hinged flaps were in turn attached to a timer, and you would stick your Mexican free-tailed bats into the compartments, and then once you had them loaded in the compartments with their bombs tied to them, the primary containment bomb was placed on a bomber, which then would fly over the area and drop the bats. The bombs would come out of the hatch, the timers would go off, the little 1,000 containment doors would open up, and the thousands of bats would go flying around with the bombs tied to their butts. It seems like a really strange idea, but somehow it got funding. As a matter of fact, $2 million worth of funding. And I'll repeat, that was in 1943. That was a lot of money. A whole lot of money, in fact. So, very odd concept to begin with. But, whatever. On May the 15th of 1943, the first test was held at Carlsbad Army Airfield. And it became the first of many places to burn flat to the ground because something very predictable happened. Something that our dentist should have figured out, that Eleanor Roosevelt should have figured out, that our engineer definitely should have figured out, that any animal behavioralist could have told them. They were feeding these bats. They were taking care of them. They were getting them used to being handled by humans. They were keeping them warm. So, when they dropped the bat bomb on their target field, instead of roosting on the target field, the bats did what any domesticated animal would do. They went home. And when they got home, they roosted in their usual roost, which for some reason were not checked that night. And the next morning, Carlsbad Army Airfield burned flat to the ground. Believe it or not, that didn't discourage them. There were 4 more official tests and several more unofficial tests of the bat bombing idea because it seemed like a good idea at the time, I guess. I don't know. But in every single incident, every single airfield burned to the ground. They lost several Army airfields, they lost several Marine Corps airfields, they lost 1 Navy airfield. And that's when it was finally decided that bat bombs wouldn't fly. Now, moving on from bats, there were actually a couple of other oddities. We can stick to the flying ones for a moment. We will talk for a second about Project Orcon, or Project Pigeon. Now, this one was the brainchild of B.F. Skinner, the famous rat shrink. B.F. Skinner decided that he was already using pigeons in various forms of behavioral conditioning studies, and he had taught them how to peck things. They could make choices. If they pecked the panels properly in the right sequence, then they got food pellets, and of course they would keep doing this. And he successfully trained pigeons to peck the various panels that had the food pellets behind it. And he did a lot of other pigeon studies that have a lot of significance, actually, to behavioral conditioning and why we are addicts to certain things. But again, that's a story for another day. Anyway, Project Orcon. This got really strange. Instead of just tying things to the pigeons and training the pigeons to fly, what they actually did was they built gliders. Again, this was in World War II. They built these gliders, and the gliders had explosive noses. And inside the noses was also a small compartment for a pigeon and a guidance system. The guidance system was on a sort of beveled arm. And what it was basically a 2-way lever, left, right, center. And there was a television set, a very small closed-circuit camera screen attached to the center of the bevel. There was also a camera on the nose of the glider. Now, the pigeons were trained when they saw the target to peck the screen. If the target veered left, then the pigeon's pecking would also veer left, which would push in the control rod, which would straighten the glider, which would bring the target back to the center of the screen. So what you had basically was a pigeon pecking guidance system. Talk about a pecking order. Again, the way it worked, pigeons would follow the targets. The goal was to keep it centered. You've done this yourself if you've ever played Duke Nukem or any other first-person shooter game, although you weren't pecking. And that's where that basic system came from, believe it or not, was Project Orcon and these pigeons. Did it work? Well, on the ground, yes. The pigeons would absolutely peck the target screens. In the air, no, not so much. The pigeons actually got very, very distracted by the motion of the glider. They were trapped in a box inside something that was flying, and that totally freaked them out. They couldn't quite cope with the motion within a motion within a motion thing. Very few animals can, and birds are known to freak out in confined spaces. So despite all of Skinner's training, it didn't really work. And also, this was happening around October the 8th of 1944. DARPA decided that it was basically insane, and they cut all the funding. And B.F. Skinner complained because he claimed that their problem wasn't that his idea was insane, but because there was another project going on at the time. You may have heard of this one. It was called the Manhattan Project. B.F. Skinner was actually quoted at the time of saying, "Here we are with a serious project that deserves major funding and is guaranteed success, and these people choose to fund a couple of lunatics in a physics lab somewhere banging atoms together," unquote. So there's a fun one for you. less into the flying realm, but still in the animal world, we also had a British tactic that was used during World War II that involved rats. Now, these rats were used in two different ways. They were used as arsonists, in which case a very long fuse was tied to their tail, and a flaming rag or incendiary bomb on a timer was attached to the tail as well, and the rats would run into various warehouses and explode or just flame. One means of doing this, because the British SS is perhaps a little more intelligent than the Army Air Corps, was that they would actually take the rats to the warehouses. Spies would take briefcases of rats to the warehouses, attach the bombs to the rats at the warehouse, or the flaming paper or whatever to the rats at the warehouse. The flaming paper thing actually worked better for a reason I'll explain in a moment. They would drop them in the various ventilation ducts, and then the rats would do what rats do. Now, the flaming rag on the rat tail thing worked better because the rat would see fire behind him and would run like heck. And as the rat was running through the building trying to get away from the fire attached to his own tail, he would set everything else on fire. So that was one way they used them. Another way they would use them was they would take dead rats, they would pack them full of explosives, and then they would leave them lying next to furnaces where the German workers, who were worried about plague and disease and so on, would pick up the dead rats and throw them in the incinerator, with the result being that the buildings would explode. So that was how the rats were used. Oddly enough, this one wasn't restricted to World War II. There's some reports that it was used during the Iraqi War by American soldiers and British soldiers, who would use the desert rats and other desert animals not specified in the report. I'm not sure what you'd use. And they would, again, do this thing where they would take them to known population centers where the enemy was and release them into the ventilation ducts. So this is apparently one that worked, unlike the bat bombs, and so is in usage to this day. I'm not going to get into the whole dolphin bombing thing today, because I don't have enough information to do so, but I will mention in passing that dolphins and porpoises have been used to bomb ships. So that was another oddity that supposedly, reportedly exists to this day, and is still in use. I don't know. I haven't found enough sources on that one. I did find sources on donkey bombs, however. Apparently, in the Iran and Iraq conflicts and in Afghanistan, it wasn't uncommon for U.S. and British soldiers, as well as Italian soldiers, to attach IED bombs to donkeys, and release the donkeys in the various marketplaces where there were reported terrorist activities. The donkeys then were draped with, donkey cargo, blankets, water bags, etc., as well as steel ball bearings, which converted the donkeys into claymore mines. And this one actually has verified reportage, including on the U.S. Army page and on the U.S. Marine Corps homepage. So if you want to know about donkey IEDs, that's apparently legit, and you can apparently Google that one. I did, and did indeed find references to that one. Now, I'm going to move on to dogs here in another form. I'm going to put a trigger warning here. If you're a serious dog lover, you're not going to want to hear this one. Just skip it. And here we go. Apparently, another very large World War II project was that the Russians were creating anti-tank dogs. And the way they were doing this was in two forms. They first fitted the dogs with the removable harnesses that contained bombs, which were on timers. And the theory was that the dogs were trained to run underneath the enemy tanks, and the bombs would go off. Some of the dogs were also fitted with non-removable harnesses with a lever on it, so that when the dog ran under the tank, the lever would collapse and the dog would go off, boom, taking off the treads of the tank. Now, you'll be pleased to hear that even though this project was running from 1941 to 1942, and the dogs were being fitted with 20 to 26 pounds of explosives, this project was a more or less total fail, and it led to the alienation of the Russian army handlers who were in charge of the dogs. So after being forced to do this for about a year, the handlers basically refused. They just stopped. But there were all sorts of other problems as well. For example, the dogs were, again, domesticated animals. They would tend to return to their home trenches. And also, when they were training the dogs, they were using Russian tanks rather than German tanks, which ran off of a different fuel, so had a different scent. And the dogs in the field had real trouble telling the difference between their own tanks and the German tanks, so a couple of Russian tanks were being blown up. And there were also cases where the dogs couldn't handle the sound. They hadn't heard the running engines, they hadn't heard the gear shifts grinding, they hadn't heard the tread rattle, there was no gunfire on the training field. So there were cases where the dogs simply refused to leave their kennels at all. And although there were 3 cores of this, it didn't take off. It didn't last for long. There were too many errors, there were too many accidents, and again, humans bond with dogs, so the handlers finally just rebelled. I only mention it because it's a known project, and you can actually go to a museum, I understand, in Germany, where they were capturing the Russian dogs and then reverse engineering them by seeing how the harnesses and levers and so on worked. They, in turn, were retraining the dogs as just basic attack dogs, which worked a lot better. So the Russians' karma literally came back to bite them in the ass on this one. And that's pretty much it for the dogs, although I will mention that there was a misguided and idiotic effort during the Iran-Iraq conflict, Gulf War I, Gulf War II, Afghanistan, to bring back dogs for use as bunker bombing dogs. They were strapping the dogs with Claymore-like apparatuses, just like they were doing with the donkeys, but with dogs it didn't work. Again, the handlers rebelled. The dogs would come home and blow up their own home turf. And you can just basically say that the whole idea of using dogs as guided missiles is just a really bad idea. It was a complete and utter fail. And that's pretty much that. I'm going to close for the day by mentioning one last thing that is still being done and is very, very odd. There was a brief movement in the cybernetics espionage area to convert living creatures into surveillance equipment. And one of the strangest of these was there was once a cat that was fitted with a set of sensors. It was a sensor array net with what is known as a net microphone built into the cat's ears, a radio transceiver implanted in the back of the cat's skull, send and receive, and the cat was released in Russia and was supposed to spy on the various Russian spies known to congregate around this one park whose name I'm forgetting and apparently didn't write down. And the cat was supposed to, sense all of the Russian conversations and beam them back to the CIA mothership. But it didn't work out that way. What actually happened was that the cat was adopted by the park residents, lived a very happy cat life for quite a while, was fed, and the majority of the recordings were things like hey kitty, cute kitty, pretty kitty kind of stuff. And eventually the cat did die. It was struck by a car at a road crossing and was granted a funeral by the Russians who had befriended it. And on that note, we will end today's episode of Dispenser of Knowledge, Weird History. And have a great day.